Being isolated in a surreal house which is filled with death traps, a cynical and doubtful voice instructs the protagonist through the house in order to freshen up and leave through the main door. Tasked with this simple mission, the protagonist goes through a challenging and perplexing journey. Hi folks, I'm R and welcome to the video. Send me your video game suggestions on Twitter, which I could cover for the next videos. This video will contain spoilers. With that said, let's begin. A sarcastic narrator introduces the game to the players, instructing them what to do in the story. As the protagonist is sleeping, the narrator instructs the players to wake him up and to change into something fresh as he has a busy day ahead. As the protagonist finally manages to dress up and leave his bedroom, after what feels like an excruciatingly long time, he tries to pull out a broken plug which ultimately leads to him getting electrocuted and dying. The narrator reassures the protagonist that it's all okay and that he can try again tomorrow, as if he's stuck in a never-ending cycle where death is just another reset button. Walking through the outside, dilapidated corridors, he comes across photographs of people he doesn't recognize, as if he's placed in an alternate version of his house. Unbothered by the strange nature of his house, the protagonist uses a USB cable he acquired from his bedroom and uses it to climb down a hole where his staircase used to be in. Going down the bowels of this dark and sinister place, the protagonist reaches a cave-like bottom with primitive drawings on the walls and many doors in place. After obtaining a knife from a surreal room having suspended chains with no walls or ceilings at sight, the protagonist goes to the kitchen where something is being cooked on its own with no one being present. Climbing through the oven, the protagonist teleports into a different side and version of the kitchen, with gas leaking, preventing the protagonist to use any sort of lighter or fire. As he progresses further, the gas leak gets into him, starting to make him feel sleepy, and eventually, the darkness becomes stronger and more invasive, until it becomes pitch black, with the protagonist only hearing monstrous and savage beings approaching him and ripping him apart while laughing, seemingly taking pleasure in their actions. Just as the protagonist shuts his eyes and takes his last breath, the narrator reassures him not to worry and that he can try again tomorrow. Next day, the protagonist, knowing what would happen to him if he hesitates, he climbs right into the fridge and gets out from the other side, with the fridge only being a drawing on the wall this time. Going back to his bedroom upstairs, the protagonist finds a big moving lump under his blanket on his bed, which seems to be a wild and vicious entity. After killing it, he traverses further inside the strange, puzzling place, only slightly resembling the house he once knew. Inside a room filled with broken mirrors, the protagonist looks at himself and brushes his teeth, getting another early morning chore out of the way, seemingly getting ready for outside and some fresh air. Traveling further down this place, he comes across something in the microwave which he manages to turn on. The item inside the microwave looks like a mass, as if not very appetizing while looking at, but on the other hand, very aromatic and smelling delicious. The protagonist proceeds to eat the mass after it's cooked in the microwave, which despite its exquisite smell, tastes just average. The narrator then congratulates the protagonist for dressing up and feeding himself, also cleaning up by brushing his teeth, as if it's the protagonist who perceives daily morning chores in such horrifying ways. Being dressed, fed, and having brushed his teeth, the protagonist heads to the main door to leave the house, which he is then faced with hardship and a strange feeling of fear. The narrator, which seems to be an internal voice now, pressures the protagonist to stay inside as it's safer and more comfortable, and as he doesn't know what he's up against on the outside. The narrator tells him to rest and give in to his fear and just try again tomorrow, which the protagonist starts feeling that something is wrong and that he's being held inside the house. He insists that he wants to leave, which is then again resisted by the internal voice, telling him that he's already done good, that he cleaned himself up, fed and dressed himself, with now being able to reward himself by staying in. When opposed, the voice becomes more manipulative, belittling the protagonist and proceeding to instruct him to go back to his bed where he can unlock the secret ending, which the voice also refers to as the real ending, the good ending. The voice clearly sounds desperate to keep the protagonist in for whatever reason, which the protagonist realizes and proceeds to insist on leaving. As he opens the door, he's faced with a pulsating, never-ending red room, which resets the day with the protagonist waking up in his bed, with an ending indicating that nothing happened and that it's the end of the game. The voice then continues to belittle and harshly criticize the protagonist, which ends the game. This time, the protagonist adheres to the narrator's instructions and demands going back to his bed. This time, it seems as if his bed was nicely prepared and presented, with the bed being lit by a spotlight, as if he was destined to go back, which he does ultimately. After some time, the bedroom transforms into an outside setting, with sunshine and a grass field, with the voice in a strange tone reassuring the protagonist that he's finally free, and that there's no more pain, fear, or stress. The voice ultimately name-calls the protagonist for being lazy, boring, and a bad person, indicating that there was no good ending after all. The other ending is achieved if the protagonist decorates his house. After this long, arduous task of decorating the house, the protagonist takes a seat and rests for a while, which slowly deters him from leaving the house and getting some fresh air. The voice then asks if he's ever happy in a rhetorical manner, with the story coming to an end and similarly belittling the protagonist. Finally, there's an ending where the protagonist opens a mysterious hatch and brings the story to an abrupt and ambiguous end. The inner voice says that this is it, as if implying the protagonist took his own life, something that he was trying to stop the protagonist from doing, even delaying it by encouraging him to rest and to try again tomorrow, despite being harsh and difficult on him. The premise of the game, as described in the description of the game, explores depression and isolation and how it could feel to someone suffering from them. The protagonist, in fact, was not in a surreal alternate dimension where monsters lurk in and an actual intelligent voice residing within. This was all how the protagonist felt and perceived things. The narrator was nothing but the negative, toxic, and extremely cynical internal voice of the protagonist, who belittled him and broke him down into not believing in himself and having self-doubt. At times, the harsh voice acted with kindness and complimented the protagonist, but always it had a judgmental tone and seemed to think of the protagonist nothing more than a lazy, useless bum. That's why each simple morning chore felt difficult and was doable only after overcoming life-threatening challenges and obstacles. The voice, while harsh and toxic, wanted to stop the protagonist from stepping outside at all costs, despite seemingly wanting him to go out in the beginning. This could explain the challenges of going through isolation and depression. One would know leaving the house and experiencing the outside as beneficial, but when faced with it, everything in them starts trembling and stopping them from doing so. Even when the protagonist managed to leave, he ended up back in his bed with the title of the ending saying nothing happened, explaining that despite the challenging and tiresome efforts of the protagonist, he achieved absolutely nothing. He was in fact stuck in a loop, failing every day and telling himself that he can try again the other day, something that kept him in this never-ending cycle. The house, regardless of how safe and comforting, can become a prison if a person locks themselves in it and finds it difficult to leave. The house transformed into a hell-like place, torturing the protagonist with everyday items such as TV or bed, becoming detrimental and a tool for tormenting the protagonist. That's it for today's video, folks. I hope that you enjoyed it. It's been your host Star, and I hope to see you on the next one.